All right, open your Bibles with me to Mark 15. We're right near the end of Mark's Gospel, and then we'll jump right on into the Gospel according to St. Luke. If you're new with us, or if you've been away a while this summer, let me sort of bring you up to date quickly here. We're going through the Bible a third time together, but this time we're just hitting highlights right today, this morning. You'll see that I'm dealing with a lot of Mark's Gospel because it's the oldest of the four. Mark was the first one to really make an attempt, as far as we know, to put down the most important things that happened in Jesus' ministry. Mark doesn't deal at all with Jesus growing up, as you recall. He begins with Jesus going down to the Jordan to be baptized by John. Scholars believe that Mark's Gospel was written right close to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by the Romans in the year 70, that either it was just immediately before or at the time of that destruction, so somewhere between 68 and 70 is their best guess. We can tell, our very best scholars can tell, and have taught others like me, that Matthew and Luke use Mark's outline for writing their own Gospels. When we begin Luke later this hour, we'll see that he says openly, I'm aware that others have undertaken to write this story. I've read those accounts, and now I'm ready to tell you, O Theophilus, what you need to know about this person, Jesus of Nazareth. Matthew and Luke follow basically Mark's outline. Mark, because they follow that outline, we call these three synoptics. They sort of look alike. They're not identical, but they do look alike because they follow Mark's outline. However, Matthew and Luke both have a lot more teaching material. They're a good bit longer than Mark's account, and so they have more teaching material. And by that, scholars usually mean parables. Even if they're little brief ones, some of the stories are rather brief and some are much longer, like the prodigal son. But they use teaching material, and the fact that they both have some of the same stories, and when they do have the same story, they have entire paragraphs. You can see this really well in Greek. When you look at the Greek text, they will have entire paragraphs where they don't differ even one word from each other, which means, of course, somebody's copying somebody, and rather than Matthew copying Luke or even Luke copying Matthew, scholars believe they had some other source. And this source was called by the Germans. Many of the great theologians through the centuries have been German, and they called it the Quelle in German, the Quelle, or source. That's all it means. So it's called the Q document by biblical scholars. A special document called Q. Yes, sir? The question is, do we think we'll ever find that source? The closest we have to it right now is the Gospel according to St. Thomas. We do have a Gospel called the Gospel according to St. Thomas, which they believe may have come out of northern Africa, where the Coptic Christians fled at a time of persecution by the Romans. And the Coptic Christians are still active in Cairo. We went to a Coptic church and worshipped there once when we were in Cairo. The Gospel according to St. Thomas is such a document in that it doesn't give times, places, just teaching material. That's all it has. It doesn't say he did this and then he did that and somebody said to him, just teaching material. And so, but they don't think Thomas was that source, at least the way we have Thomas today. Again, these two fellows have some things that are not in Thomas. And so they think there was something similar to it, but for 2,000 years they've been looking for it really hard the last 300 years, and they haven't found it so far. Okay. All right, we're right near the end of Mark's account, chapter 15, verse 1. Let's pray. God, we're really grateful for Mark, whoever that might have been, for Matthew, for Luke, for John, because in reading these four accounts we come to a fuller understanding of what you were doing in Mary's child Jesus, the growth, the calling, the sending of that one in whom we believe you were genuinely present in a way you never had been before in a human being and never would be again, except in that one, Jesus of Nazareth. Help us read and understand and apply to the living of our lives what we read and understand about what you're telling us about yourself and what you're telling us about us, and how you have always initiated right relationship with us, and when we appropriately respond, we may know ourselves rightly related to you by your grace. We offer our best efforts today in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, because Mark first wrote these things about Jesus, at least for what we've found so far, Mark's is the oldest. I'm spending a little more time on all of this than we may on some of the other Gospels. Mark first writes, and therefore, because it's oldest, scholars give a lot of importance to what Mark has to say about what happened and in what order things happened. So if you recall last Sunday, we left off at the house of Caiaphas. Those of you who've been to Israel, either with us or with some other group, know that the best scholars believe they really do have the house of Caiaphas. I told you the upper room is not authentic. It's not authentic. The architecture and everything is not that of 2,000 years ago. It's that of Western European, more Roman architecture. Somebody like Wally Wozencraft could explain to you all those differences. I don't know exactly what they are, but the arches and so on that are in the present-day upper room are just not of 2,000 years ago. They're of the Crusader period. So that's why I didn't see any particular reason we should go to that upper room. But Caiaphas' house, they think this is the real thing. And the steps that come up the hill, it's its own hill, those of you who've been there recall, and you can look out the back of Caiaphas' house. I mean, it was really a prominent place, still is. It's right near, when I say right near, it's a quarter mile maybe from the old wall portion of the city. Okay, it's outside the walls. And if you look sort of north and a little bit east, you're looking right at the Mount of Olives over there where Jesus was arrested. There's a deep valley there. You recall, one side of that valley goes around the old wall portion of the city and is called the Kidron, and the other part was cut by a similar little brook that runs very full when it rains, and it was called Hinnom, the Valley of Hinnom. And before David took this place from the Jebusites, the residents there before offered human sacrifice in that valley. And so it's always been, off limits to Jews that humans were actually offered there. And so that's where they built the city dump. Literally, they built the city dump in that ravine, and the word Hinna in time became Gehenna, the place of the fire that never goes out, the city dump. Okay, so you still can see, there's no city dump there now, but that ravine is still there, and the Kidron is still there, carving out it around the Temple Mount. And Caiaphas' house is looking. You can look really sharply to your left. There's some buildings there, but you could see that ravine of the Hinnom Valley if you look carefully enough. But you can see much better the Kidron, and just immediately across this little brook, the Mount of Olives. So if they were in fact brought him, Jesus, that night there, and up those steps, dating shows that those steps are 2,000 years old. They are 2,000 years old, and Jesus and the others might probably did step on those very steps. So it's a special place. First time we were there was no physical manifestation of the rooster, and Peter's denying Jesus. So they've added one. We were there first in 1983, and in all those intervening years, they keep adding little things that they know, tourists, pilgrims want to see. So now there is a rooster there, and there's a figure of a very dejected-looking Simon Peter in the garden at Caiaphas' house. Okay. So that's where we left off. Jesus has told this, bold Simon who said, everybody else may leave you, I will never ever leave you. Oh, yes you will, Simon. You'll be frightened like the rest of them, and before the rooster crows twice to signal the new day, Friday, you will have denied me 3 times, which was very, very significant, 3 times. And he did. That's where we left off. As soon as it was morning, this is Friday now, the chief priest held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. So this simply means the ruling party in Jerusalem, those who are in charge of the temple and who know that they have to keep peace with the Romans. The Romans dominated everything in that period, as you recall. High priest was supposed to be chosen for life out of the tribe of Levi, and the tribe of Levi produced Moses and Aaron and Miriam. So the high priest was supposed to be from that family, and once he had been chosen, he was to be high priest as long as he was physically, mentally able to function. Well, the Romans didn't like the high priest at one point, so they just said, no, you're out. And they made his son-in-law the high priest. So Annas is out and Caiaphas is in and so on. There was even a time when the Romans didn't want the high priest to function without their being present and okaying everything, so they locked up his robes, his vestments, and kept the key, and he had to ask permission to put on his vestments and perform some religious rites. So they were trying desperately to get along with the Romans. You have to understand and give them a little bit at that point. But, of course, what they end up doing is atrocious. It's horrible, absolutely horrible. I've told you this story, but I want to reemphasize because I think it might be helpful to you. You know that in Germany, they have done a play, the Passion Play at Oberammergau, for 400 years since the time of the Great Plague. The people of Oberammergau, it's a small, beautiful little German town. When the Passion Play is not going on, it's a very quiet and beautiful little German town. We've been there, when the play wasn't going on. I'll never forget one night when we had been to Neuschwanstein, the beautiful castle that Disney modeled the Magic Kingdom after. One of Crazy Ludwig's castles there, nestled in the Alps. What a really beautiful place. Gail and I were there again just 2 years ago. We'd been there that day, and it had drizzled rain on us all day, and we'd had a long, hard day trying to get into that castle. There's always a long line, and we had to, get in line and wait, and they take you through in groups then. And then you could either wait for a shuttle, a little bus to take you back down that mountain, or you could walk. We just, let's walk instead of waiting in line. And so we had walked down, and still drizzling rain on us all day. And we were to spend the night that night in Oberammergau. It's near the little town of Fussen. And Gail and I stayed at Fussen when we were there a couple of years ago. But we went, the bus took us back to Oberammergau. And it was a small little hotel. Our group of 40, 2 or 3, whatever we had, basically was it. We filled the little hotel. And when the meal was over, and it was a nice German meal, but they didn't have much dessert. And I don't remember what it was, but when we got through, everybody started going to their rooms. I said to my mom and dad and our boys and Gail, I want some apple strudel. There must be apple strudel in this town somewhere. And my mom and dad said, it's raining. It's raining. It's been raining all day. I said, I don't care. I think there's some apple strudel in this little town somewhere. And I'm going looking. Anybody want to go? And they all said, no, but you whistle if you find some. So I went looking, and surely enough, I found a little restaurant. Had to go down the street and around a corner and stuff. And they had a fireplace going in there, and I asked them, do you have Apfelstrudel? Yeah. And mit Schlagsahne with whipped cream on it? Yeah, sure. I said, We want some apple strudel. So I went back to that corner and here came my whole family. My mom and dad and Gail and the boys, everybody wanted some apple strudel. Well, they've been putting on this passion play every 10 years, every decade, because after praying and praying and praying, their little village was not wiped out by the Great Plague. They felt God had sort of passed over them. And so they, not let them all die. And so they promised they would do a passion play depicting the life of Jesus every 10 years, forever. And they've done that. It's a long, long production, hours and hours. And the cast is chosen a year in advance, and they're all supposed to get into character for the next 12 months. And they rehearse. But even after the Holocaust of the last century, the Jews really were beaten up in the Passion play. I mean, as recently as 1985, they were doing it in mid-decade, and they finally got with the even-numbered years. After 400 years, they said, let's go with the even-numbered years. So they did it again last year in 2010. But in 1985, they still were depicting the Jewish priest with horns growing out of their heads. I mean, it was unbelievable. And so the World Council of Churches, other religious groups kept saying to them, you are contributing to the problem. You're contributing to the problem. That when the gospel writers talk about the Jews, they're talking about the hierarchy in Jerusalem, not about the populace. The populace who were Jews followed him all the way to Jerusalem, grieved for him, mourned for him, wept for him, followed him down that little hill on Palm Sunday morning and so on. They didn't get it. Gail and I were in Germany again a couple of years ago, as I told you, and they were preparing for the 2010 Passion play. And at that time, the newspapers were raging about Pope Benedict XVI. When he was the Archbishop in Germany, there were priests abusing little boys, altar boys and so on, who were sexually abusing these little boys. And they got passed from parish to parish to parish instead of being drummed out of the priesthood. And they were railing against, the question was, when we were there, the newspapers were all asking, how much did he know and when did he know it and so on? Was he involved in any way? And the Vatican's trying desperately to say, no, he wasn't aware of that. He was not making those kind of decisions. His bishops were doing that. As Archbishop, he was not doing that and so on. And one of the articles in Die Zeitung in Berlin said, they finally got it in Germany. They finally got it, that there were thousands of wonderful German Catholics who wouldn't have hurt a little boy for the world. It was the hierarchy. It was the hierarchy who perpetuated that grievous sin against those little boys. They got it. There's a difference between the Jews and those who were in authority in Jerusalem. They changed the Passion play dramatically. Okay? All right, so that's the point here. And John in his gospel, when we get to it, you'll see that he just tosses this out all the time. The Jews, the Jews, the Jews. And many people don't realize he's talking about the hierarchy there in Jerusalem. They had, were trying so desperately to please the Romans, whatever it took to please the Romans, that they would allow this travesty against justice to take place. All right. Anyway, those who are the hierarchy in Jerusalem gathered early that Friday morning. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Now, the Antonius fortress was destroyed by the Romans later, after the time of Jesus. But in the scale models of Jerusalem, and they always say this is what Jerusalem looked like in the time of Herod the Great. But of course, Jesus was born into that time, so it's the Christian era for us Christians. They have the Antonius fortress. Those of you who were with us in February, if you remember when we, went down some steps, and finally they were showing us that stone pavement where the Roman soldiers played games, and scratched into that marble granite pavement. Something almost like a checkerboard, a chessboard, and so on, the games that they played while they had to, stand watch at the Antonius fortress. That part is original. That's 2,000 years old. The fortress itself is gone. The pavement is still there. Okay. So Pontius Pilate had come riding in, on some magnificent stallion from the Mediterranean. Before the week of Passover, he arrived on Sunday morning, the first day of the work week, Palm Sunday for us. So Jesus was coming in from the east, riding a burro, and Pontius Pilate and all these Roman legionnaires, were coming in from Caesarea. All right. Now they take Jesus to the Antonius fortress and hand him over to Pilate. Pilate asked him. Now you can imagine what Jesus must have looked like at this point. He hasn't slept. He's been in great anguish over what's been happening, what's about to happen. We talked last week. Dr. Swafford asked the question. Some scholars think Jesus, he knew that the authorities were not happy with him, that they might insist that he be killed, but if they were to kill him, he would have been stoned to death. And he's quoted as saying, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how oft would I have gathered you to myself, stoning the prophets, and so on. So he might have thought, if they kill me, that's the way they're going to do it. Instead, wow, they hand him over to the Romans, and they don't stone, they crucify. Anyway, Jesus, he's a peasant. He's not a person of any money. So his garments, no sleep, no rest, not eating probably very well that terrible week. Pilate looks at him and said, Are you the king of the Jews? He answered him, You say so. Is he going to refute all these high priests whom Pilate, trusts to some degree at least? Then the chief priest accused him of many things. Pilate asked him again, Have you no answer? See how many charges they bring against you? But Jesus made no further reply, so that Pilate was amazed. Now, you'll find in the other Gospels, they have this little bit of conversation, that little bit. In John's Gospel, you'll see more. Not in Mark. Mark wrote first. Are you the king? You say so. That's it. Now at the festival, they mean Passover, he, Pilate, used to release a prisoner for them, anyone for whom they asked. Now a man called Barabbas was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder during the insurrection. These were bad people. There were zealots who had their little curved knives that they loved to stick into the belly of a Roman anytime they could get one off by himself. They were bad people. That's the kind of guy Barabbas was. So the crowd came and began to ask Pilate to do for them according to his custom. Now remember here when it says the crowd, you can look at the scale model of the Antonius fortress, and that courtyard there where Pilate would have been standing is relatively small. 50 people, 75 people, not thousands, not the ones who followed him down the hill on Sunday. Scholars are convinced of that. Father Crossan and others who've been a part of the Jesus seminar say these who are screaming for him to be crucified are not the ones who followed him. They are not the ones who followed him. These are the hierarchy and those whom the hierarchy had paid to come down there and stage a protest, if you would. All right. The crowd came and began to ask Pilate to do for them according to his custom. He answered, Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews? For he realized that it was out of jealousy that the chief priest had handed him over. Pilate was fairly perceptive. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas for them instead. If that's the choice, we'll take Barabbas. Pilate spoke to them again. What do you wish me to do with the man you call king of the Jews? They shouted back, Crucify him. Pilate asked, Why? What evil has he done? They shouted all the more, Crucify him. So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. Okay. You see anything here about Pilate's wife and washing his hands and so on? Then the soldiers led him into the courtyard of the palace, that is, the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole cohort. They clothed him in a purple cloak, and after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on him. They began saluting him. "Hail, King of the Jews!" They struck his head with a reed. It would be like a bamboo sort of thing. Spat upon him. Knelt down, mocking, making fun. After mocking him, they stripped him of the purple cloak. Purple, remember, means royalty, and put his own clothes back on him, and they led him out to crucify him. They compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. Let me go back just a second. Do you see that in Mark's account, Pilate doesn't come across as any specially good person at all? He's just sort of disinterested. Now, the other Gospels get written a little later, when Domitian and other Caesars were making life more difficult for Christians. And scholars believe that Pilate's role gets tempered a little more and a little more to curry favor with the Romans, to make the hierarchy of Jews the real villains, and Pilate an innocent bystander who washed his hands and wants no part of the whole thing. You don't get all that in Mark. Okay. They compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. And notice here, it was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. There's no indication that this Simon knew anything at all about Jesus. It says he was just a passerby. Told him, Jesus is falling down, needs some help. Scholars believe today that where the Romans crucified, the vertical posts were probably kept up all the time, and that when people were crucified, they had to carry their cross member out, and then they were lifted up, and it was hooked on to the vertical part that was already there. More scholars believe that than that Jesus was actually carrying the whole thing. You still see people in Jerusalem on Good Friday every year carrying the whole thing, but they think that's not probably the way it was done when Jesus lived. Nonetheless, Jesus has gone hours and hours with nothing to eat, and now he's been beaten horribly, and he's stumbling, falling. That's almost for sure. But in the Bible, where writing materials are very expensive for ordinary folk, you choose very carefully what you write, and who gets his or her name mentioned and who doesn't. Mark chooses here to tell the name of the man who carried the cross, but I think even more significant is the fact that he says the father of Alexander and Rufus, which leads scholars to believe those who were going to read Mark's account knew Alexander and Rufus. Why else would he have said it that way? That they knew. We don't know them. We don't know them, who Alexander and Rufus were. But scholars believe Mark knew who they were, and his readers would know who they were. So if Simon was just a passerby who's made to carry the cross, the implication is that he stayed around long enough to see what happened, and that his own two sons became disciples, whom readers of Mark's Gospel would know. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which simply means a skull. They offered him wine mixed with myrrh. This was a very primitive kind of anesthetic. He refuses it. Martin Luther, 500 years ago, in writing on this passage, said Jesus did not want to be in a drugged condition for these last moments of his life. He wanted to be fully aware of what was going on. The Gospels lead us to believe he had a few things yet to say, and if he were anesthetized to the point that he was not fully conscious, he might not have been able to do the next 3 hours in a way that would become very meaningful for those who were close by. So he didn't take it. They crucified him, divided his clothes among them, casting lots to decide what each should take. I mean, these are Roman soldiers. They're grubby guys, Hey, take whatever you can. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. He would hang there about 6 hours till 3 in the afternoon. The inscription of the charge against him read, if you're going to want passers-by to know why this fellow's being crucified. Well, they said he claimed to be king of the Jews. With him they crucified two bandits, one on his right, one on his left. Those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads, accusatory, and saying, "Ha ha, you who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests, along with the scribes, were also mocking him among themselves and saying, "Well, he saved others. He cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross now, so that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him also taunted him. Okay. Here you do not have one of the thieves being repentant. Not in Mark's account, you say. When it was noon, it's been hanging there 3 hours now. Darkness came over the whole land for 3 more hours, till 3 in the afternoon. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice. And this is, we talk about the 7 last sentences of Jesus, 7 last words. Mark has only one, just one. You have to look in all 4 Gospels to produce 7. You have to gather them. In Mark, just one. And here he's crying out in Aramaic, his native tongue, which has some similarities to Hebrew. And the oldest name the Jews had for God was El, or Elohim. And so here you have Eloi, the first part of Elohim, Eloi lima sabachthani. And Mark knows his readership doesn't know Aramaic. He thought it important to put down exactly what Jesus cried out, but then he's got to explain to his readers what that meant. My God, why have you forsaken me?" Now you know that in other moments, in the garden the night before, he prayed, "Abba, my Father." Now he uses a term that's not considered nearly so intimate, if you would. He's not feeling that God is intimate. The Bible, in any number of places, deals with the immanence, the closeness of God, and the transcendence of God. And transcendence, remember, comes from Latin, transcendere, across, to climb, literally to climb across. In God's case, the whole universe, the God who's big enough to climb across the whole universe. There were moments that Jesus felt he was really close. Now he feels he's really remote. You ever have these feelings yourself? See? Some of the bystanders heard it and said, "Listen, he's calling for Elijah." Now notice the first syllables there are quite similar. Eloi, because Hebrew-speaking folk don't say Elijah, they say Elijah. Elijah sounds similar. Okay. Listen, he's calling for Elijah. Someone ran, filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink. Now, when I was a little boy, my Sunday school teachers thought this was terribly cruel, but sour wine is what the Roman soldiers carried in their goat skins to drink. They weren't being cruel to him at this point. Not being cruel, they were trying to be kind, whoever did this. It doesn't say. He tells you who Simon of Cyrene was, Alexander and Rufus. Here, just somebody heard him cry. They ran to bring him something to drink. This was a kind act, not a hateful, mean act. But even so, these words, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down." If that, in fact, is who he's calling, then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. Here the word breath, is pneuma in Greek, from which we get pneumonia. Words like that, it has to do with breathing. Pneumonia, of course, is when something goes wrong with your breathing. It can mean wind, breath, spirit. Just as the Hebrew word ruach can mean all three. These two words are synonyms of each other. very good translations of each other. God created humans, took a deep breath and breathed into them His own Ruach. Jesus has now surrendered His. We're told by medical people who've studied all four accounts carefully, and who've also looked for records in the Roman Empire, Josephus and others who write about crucifixions, and we're told that driving stakes probably through the wrist instead of the palm of the hand would tear out fairly easily, probably through the wrist and ankles, and they have evidence of bones 2,000 years old with such places in the bones, wrists and ankles. Extremely painful, but not immediately life-threatening. You could live a long time. That in fact, people did hang on crosses sometimes for days before they died. And the big problem was fluid collecting in the lungs around the heart. Dr. Brown, others could tell you far more about this than I could, but that's what I've read anyway, and that as long as a person could push up with the legs, as painful as that might have been, almost every painting you've ever seen of Jesus, the knees are bent. You notice? The knees are bent, sort of sagging down against the weight of the spikes and so on. Okay, but as long as you could push up and take another deep breath, you could live longer. When you simply could not push up anymore, then death came more quickly. And so that's one of the reasons that we have in some accounts, they broke the legs of the one on either side of him so they'd go ahead and die. The curtain of the temple was torn into top to bottom. It wasn't torn bottom to top. The curtain, we know about that curtain. Way back when Moses was leading the children through the wilderness, the desert, God said, I want a separate tent for me. You have tents for everybody else, but just outside the camp, another tent. I want you to call it the tent of the presence. And eventually, I want you to make this beautiful box, and in this beautiful box, I want you to put the tablets of the Ten Commandments and put them in the tent of presence. And there will be an outer portion of the tent into which a number of people can go, but there's an inner portion with a beautiful curtain through which only the high priest will go. And he, only once a year, to ask God at Yom Kippur to move, please, from the seat of judgment to the seat of mercy. Once a year. Once a year. And now when Solomon builds the temple, by George, after we finish these stories of Jacob and Joseph, the lectionary jumps 2 weeks from now to the dedication of the temple in Jerusalem, when Solomon got it built, the dedication of the temple, and how they brought the beautiful box with the tablets into the Sanctum Sanctorum, the Holy of Holies, inside the curtain. And once again, only once a year, the high priest could go in. Now, you know that box was never seen after the Babylonians destroyed the temple in 587, before the coming of Jesus. Okay. No one's ever found it. Almost for sure, they destroyed it, they burned it up, destroyed the tablets, ground them into bits, whatever. Never been found. But when the temple was rebuilt, they did have still a Holy of Holies, they just didn't have the beautiful box and the tablets. And Mark, you see, is saying something very important here. From the top, the curtain is torn all the way down. You don't need the high priest to go in and ask God to move from the seat of judgment to the seat of mercy. Jesus has taken care of that for you. God has moved. He's moved. He's had mercy on Jesus. You will see that on Sunday morning. He will have mercy on you too. Okay. Now, when the centurion, we know this word, of course. We have it in the word century. We know in Latin it has to do with 100. So a centurion was simply the commander of 100. Somebody who had 100 men under his command. Important people. Now when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly this man was God's Son." In Mark's Gospel, the disciples never quite get it. As long as Jesus is alive, they never quite get it. But here's a Gentile who gets it. Mark's writing to Gentiles. He's writing to Gentiles. And he's saying to those who read what he's written, the curtain of the temple has been torn for you too. Take a look at Jesus of Nazareth. You can see he was the Son of God. You can see he's moved from the seat of judgment to the seat of mercy. There were also women looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary, and it literally says, of Magdala. Those of you who've been to Tiberias up on the lake, remember that it sits about where the Nine would be if the lake were the face of a clock. As you go round the lake, north from Tiberias, toward Capernaum, which sat at about where the 12 was, it's not far, you recall, 3 or 4 miles? Maybe not even that far. Okay, as you start north out of Tiberias, right there on the side of the hill was Magdala, ancient Magdala. Okay, there were women there watching everything. One of them was Mary of Magdala, and Mary, the mother of James the Younger, and of Joseph, and Salome. Now, this doesn't mean, of course, the Salome who danced and John the Baptist lost his head. This was a fairly common name. These used to follow him. Okay, so these are not screaming, "Crucify." These are disciples. Disciple means learners. They're not in the 12, but they're followers. Notice what else? They brought their purses with them. They followed him and provided for him when he was in Galilee. He's asked the disciples to leave their work, quit fishing in their boats, leave everything, and come and follow him. Who's going to feed them? His women. They're providing for them. There were many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem. So he names 3, but there were lots of others too. So the Gentile Christian movement must include women. This cannot be an old boys club here. He did this for women too. He welcomed women too. They followed him also. When evening had come, and since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was also himself waiting expectantly for the kingdom of God. Remember, Dr. Brandon Scott and others say everything Jesus taught was about the kingdom of God. Went boldly to Pilate, and you'd have to have a certain amount of courage to go to this Roman governor who could sentence you to death in the twinkling of an eye if he wanted to, if he's in a bad mood. He was functioning like a king, if you would, in the king's absence. The king was the Caesar, of course, who lived in Rome. He went boldly to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate wondered if he were already dead. You see, he knows people can hang on crosses a long time. And summoning the centurion, this head of 100 of his soldiers, inquired whether he had been dead for some time. Was he really dead? You're really sure? When he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the body to Joseph. So there's nothing in Mark's account about breaking the legs of the other 2. John tells you all about that. Then Joseph bought a linen cloth, taking down the body, wrapped it in the linen cloth, and laid it in a tomb that had been hewn out of the rock. He then rolled a stone against the door of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where the body was laid. They're really following everything. They saw him take the body down, and they saw where he put it. They saw him have the stone rolled over the face. Again, the debate, and I've mentioned this, and we will again, is whether Constantine's mother got the right place for building the Church of the Holy Sepulchre or not. It would be a British General Gordon who would decide 100 years ago when the British controlled Palestine that from his hotel window he could see a little bank with dirt and rock that looked to him like it might be a skull. He had soldiers standing around doing next to nothing. He had them start digging. And as they dug, they found a tomb hewn out of solid rock. They found irrigation ditches. They found a cistern for collecting water in the rainy season to water the beautiful garden the rest of the year. He decided he had found the garden tomb. Those of you who've been there know that the rocky face that he thought he saw, still there, and from there to the tomb is 50 yards, maybe, no more, I don't think, maybe 50 yards. At the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is inside the present wall, they have created in the church itself, you climb up some stairs, and they have a place they say it is a solid rock there supporting everything, and that it looked like a skull. And so they have a very beautiful stylized cross, and then you keep traffic circulating. So you come down another set of stairs, and right there at the bottom of the stairs, between the two stairways, is a big marble slab, and they say this is where his body was placed as it was taken down, and where it was rolled in linen. And then just immediately, they have a small little building inside the church, and again, priests are guarding that, and you can wait in line for 45 minutes or an hour if you want to get to go in and around and right back out. It's very small. You get to see both when you go. You can see the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and sort of decide whether you feel closer there or you feel closer at the garden tomb. The Anglican Church, Church of England, they ended up buying that property that General Gordon found, and they have kept up the garden tomb, the gardens, all these years, and have gradually built little places around in the garden with trees sort of shielding one little place from another that groups can have Holy Communion there. And they've got this down to a fine science now. If you go to certain shops to buy souvenirs, that shop owner gives the guide a lot of little cups, little tiny cups made out of olive wood, and the guide takes them to the garden tomb with you, and while you're looking around and being shown, they're being filled, prepared for communion for you, if you have proper clergy there to consecrate the elements. And if you don't, one of the Anglicans will do it for you. So you can have Holy Communion there. When the Sabbath was over, of course, Sabbath, you recall, is Friday sundown till Saturday sundown for Jews. Mary of Magdala and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. Okay, so as soon as sun goes down on Saturday, shops open up again. So they could go and get what they needed. As soon as the shops opened on Saturday night, they got what they needed and then waited for sunrise on Sunday, when everybody goes back to work. Very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" And when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side. And when you see the garden tomb, the one General Gordon and his men found, you walk in and that's where the body would be, right there on the right side, as Mark describes it. Okay. They saw this young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. The word is more terrified. But he said to them, "Do not be terrified. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth." In other words, they're looking for that real person, that flesh and blood person whom they've come to love and whom they've followed, for 75 miles down that river road 17 miles uphill into Jerusalem. They're looking for that one. I know. And notice here who was crucified. I mean, no question about who they're looking for. What's happened to him, that he was really dead. Mark is making all of this very clear. But this messenger from God knows everything. He's come from God. He knows what the women are doing there and who they're looking for. Look, there is the place they laid him, but go. This is the role of an apostle, you see. Apostello, go. He's sending them out. Go. Tell his disciples and Peter. Okay, notice how Peter's singled out here. Again, scholars have felt for centuries that somehow either Simon himself, though he's dead with 68 or 70, but that Simon himself imparted much of this story, or either those who followed him as the disciples left the city of Jerusalem. Communities, faith communities, sprang up around John and James and Peter and so on. In John's Gospel, of course, the writer loves John, and he's just sure Jesus loved John. And so he never calls John by name. He calls him the whole way through the disciple whom Jesus loved, the disciple whom Jesus loved. Well, in this one, it's Peter. Peter's the central figure. So go tell the disciples, and Peter. And he may be singled out too because the last time we heard from Peter, he was saying, I don't know him, I don't know him, I was never with him. And Peter, he's going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Okay, I want you to notice here that we have end of that material, right there at the end of verse 8. And then, I'm sure in the translation you have, it says there's a shorter ending of Mark, and then there's a longer ending of Mark. And then you have a long footnote, at least my Bible does, and this footnote says, some of the most ancient authorities bring the book to a close at the end of verse 8. And what they're really telling you is the manuscripts that are older and they believe are even better have nothing after verse 8, period. And the women ran, they were frightened to death. End. They believe because King James scholars in 1611, it's been 400 years this year since the King James Version, 400 years ago, they did not have available to them these manuscripts that your scholars are telling you about. They didn't have them. And the manuscripts they had available to them, from which they were translating into King James English, had a longer ending. And so the longer ending is printed here for you, but the scholars want to tell you, we think these endings were added. In the copying that took place, you know we have no original manuscripts of any of the New Testament writings. We do not have any original. They go back about 1,000 years. And writings before that time, the writing materials failed, and they had to keep copying and copying and copying because the writing materials failed. And so they're saying they believe you go with the oldest, because again, people don't tend, when they're copying, to take something away. They tend to add. If they do anything, they add. They don't take away. And so they think this material was added. Now, if, in fact, Mark just ended his gospel at verse 8, what do you think he was trying to convey? And one of my favorite commentaries on this passage says that Mark seems to be saying, all right, here you have it. You have an empty tomb. You have women who say they saw a messenger who actually spoke to them and told them he knew who they were and the one they were looking for, and he had been raised. Boom. If anybody's going to tell this story, it's going to have to be you. By the time Mark writes, the women are all dead. All the eyewitnesses are gone. If somebody's going to keep telling this story, it'll have to be you and me. Keep telling, keep telling. Now, by the time Matthew and Luke and John write, they say, wait, that wasn't the end of the story. No, the women did what they were told. They might have been frightened to death, but they did what they were told. They went to the upper room and they told the disciples. And Peter and John ran themselves to the tomb, and so on. We've already seen what Matthew thought was important to add, and we'll see what Luke and John thought was important to add. But this seems to be the way Mark ended his. Okay? All right, if you haven't been to church, don't rush off. Next week we will start with Luke, and that'll be August the 14th.